out. Everybody.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Lights Out. I'm your host, Josh.
And I'm your host, Austin.
And I'm the producer, Daniel.
And we're back with another one. One just gets crazier, I feel like, every week.
Yeah.
Just when I think I've seen the worst of humanity. No.
Somebody's always out there breaking more records of how to be a terrible person.
And that's exactly what we're talking about today. Mr. Michael Bear Carson, or his birth name, James Carson. And we'll explain the name change later.
Yeah.
Because it's a little confusing. But he was back in the 60s, the hippie movement. It was a good time for many and not so good time for others. But Mr. Carson, I'd like to think that he wasn't always a bad person.
I think so too, yeah.
You know what I mean? I'd like to think that, and based on what his daughter has said, because his daughter is very, very outspoken about what she went through growing up. But this case, anyways, is called the San Francisco Witch Killers. And this is the name that the media gave Michael and this woman, Suzan, and their subsequent crime spree that they went on. Basically, they went on this holy war and went after people they believe were witches in the early 1980s. And they murdered at least 3 people in cold blood in very brutal ways. But not only that, just the philosophical ideologies that these two had just gets fucking wild. There's no other way to put it.
Yeah. And none of it really makes sense.
No.
And they kind of just pick and choose what they like and how they can justify their actions with. Yeah, there's no thread that makes any sense through any of their ideologies.
And when you see a picture of Mr. Carson, you may have to take a second look, because he definitely has got the whole Charles Manson vibe going on for sure. And this is a group that I feel give them enough time, if they hadn't gone and started killing people almost immediately, that perhaps they would have formed into a cult potentially.
Yeah.
Through these ideologies that they were. They're. I don't know though. I don't know if they'd even be able to convince people to believe the shit that these guys believe, because it is absolutely bonkers.
Yeah.
And then you mix in substances, of course, lots of psychedelics during this time period, and these guys were big fans of those. So it definitely brings into question, was it just the drugs? Was there perhaps some undiagnosed mental illnesses going on there? Because there's not a lot known about Mr. Carson's early life.
No, unfortunately. Couldn't find much about his childhood, which, that could go to show us a bit more. I think that's why we like some of these cases. You get a peek into their upbringing that might explain what goes on later. But yeah, unfortunately, we don't get a lot of that. We get more of the story kind of begins when it's more into his 20s, early 20s.
Yeah, but he does say some things. He talks about murdering someone in high school with his mind.
Yeah.
Which I don't even know how to interpret that.
Right.
Is that just some fucking crazy thing that he made up? Most likely, probably.
Yeah. Does he believe it himself?
Yeah. Maybe.
Yeah.
So this is the story of the San Francisco Witch Killers. So, like we mentioned, James Clifford Carson, who later went by Michael Bear, and we'll explain that, but he was born on November 28th, 1950. We really don't know much about his childhood. I think we all would like to know more about his childhood, because I bet you there is something that happened that would help us understand where he ended up, but maybe not. You never know.
Yeah, if I had to guess, this is total speculation. If I had to guess, there's probably some mental illness in his family history somewhere along the way, if I had to guess.
I'd say that's a pretty fair guess to make. But by the 1960s, James joined the hippie counterculture movement that was rapidly growing across the nation. He even protested for peace and was vocally against the Vietnam War, as many hippies were at the time. And James would join in by his late teen, early 20s, and reportedly one of his favorite psychedelics that he used quite often was peyote, which contains mescaline. And this was his drug of choice. But one thing that James was known for early on was his anger issues. And he was even sometimes overheard expressing that he would kill anyone who upset him. So it seems like as far back as we can go, there's definitely violent tendencies there, or at least unstable emotions. And he, there's always this violence sort of lurking underneath the surface, it seemed like.
Yeah.
And it seemed like his anger went directly against, the whole hippie movement of free love and peace, but his friends never took his statements seriously. It was like, okay, whatever, dude.
Kind of just goofing around or something.
We all kind of do.
Yeah.
Sometimes we don't take it seriously. Like, we just know our friends or feel like we know them and they're like just full of shit.
Right.
Just trying to give people a hard time or,
yeah.
In the late 60s, when he was in his 20s, he married an elementary school teacher named Lynn. And although he was relatively kind and gentle when they first met, she did witness his rage as it escalated over the years. Lynn was also part of the hippie counterculture movement, and she would often respond to James's outbursts with pacifism. In one incident, he got so upset that he said he was going to kill someone. And this wasn't the first time that he had said something like that. Usually most people around him, just took it as like a turn of phrase when he was angry, oh, you're just saying stuff. You don't mean that. You're not being serious. But this particular time, James grabbed a gun and appeared to be heading out of the house. Luckily, Lynn was able to stop him and get the gun away from him and calm him down. But by then, it was hard to ignore that her husband was deeply disturbed. James would occasionally return to the gentle, loving husband he was before, and Lynn would see glimpses of the man that she fell in love with. So she lived in denial about his violent nature for a long time. She began noticing that his violent anger escalated alongside his drug abuse. He had once used drugs recreationally, but she could see how they had a more controlling presence in his life as years went on. Alongside his substance abuse, his worldviews also became more radicalized. He soon began talking about how politicians needed to be assassinated and the government needed to be violently overthrown, which that's a major turn.
Yeah.
It's one thing to just say, talk shit, you know what I mean, and just shit on politicians and celebrities and whatnot, but to talk about assassinating politicians and violently overthrowing the government,
right,
definitely taking a step further.
So I think the difference is, to expand on that, I definitely, you can see people being frustrated with politics, with your government and everything, saying things that seem really radical. But I also think the fact that she has witnessed this man grab a firearm and leave the house, you're like, okay, maybe this isn't someone who would just, quote unquote,
just
talk
talks
shit.
about.
Yeah. This maybe is someone who would enact something that they feel passionately about. So I think that's the difference between, I don't know, if you're talking with your friends about, politics or
as
whatever,
we do sometimes.
And you say something kind of weird. There's a difference between, oh, well, I know Jimmy and he's just trying to make us laugh or just being crazy.
But if Jimmy grabs a gun, heads out the door,
then you have a problem.
Right. Clearly, James's thoughts and actions are continuing to get worse and worse. And at one point, he even admits to Lynn that back in high school, he murdered somebody using his mind. No idea what that means.
No.
But I think it really just speaks to where his headspace is at.
Yeah.
I mean,
absolutely.
It's a pretty wild thing to fucking say.
Yeah.
I mean, you can take that for what it is. But imagine being Lynn. And here's this guy, you're like, whoa.
Yeah. And I mean, if you take your marriage vows seriously, right, that is in sickness and in health, right? So like, I think people really take that to heart. So, if you see your husband as like mentally ill, even though there's obviously a fine line where you do need to leave. But at the same time, as far as we know, he had not been physically violent with her up until this point,
right? Just mentally, and it's it speaks to thoughts is going through his head, potentially conversations that they're having, unless it's just like a random thing. Hey, right. I murdered somebody in high school in my mind. But like, whoa, what'd you say?
Yeah.
But by the time of this rapid decline, James and Lynn had a daughter together, Jennifer, who went by Jenn, and their daughter changed the couple's dynamic for a time, which is a huge change to have a child together, and probably very worrisome for Lynn, bringing a child into the world with this particular person, and he's saying these crazy things.
Right. I can only imagine.
But it sounds like they had some good days too.
Yeah, because according to Jenn, the early days with her father were idyllic. She remembered him as a fun father who was attentive, loving, and gentle. He would even read to her and braid her hair, and he was a stay-at-home dad for years, but Jenn unfortunately also saw her father unravel over time. So by 1977, Lynn and James had been married for about a decade, and the couple and their daughter lived in Phoenix, Arizona at the time. Typically, Lynn put up with James's odd behavior for years, as we've been saying, but soon she really just couldn't take it anymore. So around this time, Lynn wanted to shift over to a daycare job. Remember, she was an elementary school teacher, so she wanted to go over to daycare. And then she also wanted James to get back to work because he had been working during this time when she was going out to work. He was staying home and raising their daughter. But this caused a lot of tension in the household, and James's mental health was clearly not improving over this time. It was only getting worse. And by the time Jenn was about 3 or 4 years old, the couple fought constantly. And Jenn remembered a lot of screaming and yelling during that time, and sometimes she would witness her mother and father even shoving each other, so it was getting physical at this point. James would turn violent whenever they argued, and the final straw was when James threw a glass out of anger, and the glass shard ended up cutting their daughter's knee. Lynn then took their daughter and left the house immediately. James and Lynn then divorced the following year, and Jenn maintained a complicated relationship with her father since her parents did end up sharing custody after the divorce. I believe she would go over there on weekends, but her mother had her for the rest of the week. Almost immediately after Lynn had left James, he found a new woman. Her name was Suzan Barnes, and she was about 9 years older than him. Suzan was known as very flirtatious, as she was outgoing. She was also a divorcee, and they first met at a party in 1978 that Suzan was hosting at her house. They had an instant connection, and some even compared their chemistry to like throwing a match on gasoline. And it was at that party Suzan asked him if his name was Michael, and he said, "No, my name's not Michael," but she emphasized that she felt like his name was Michael after the archangel. In biblical lore, if you don't know, Michael defeats the dragon, interpreted as Satan. In the book of Revelation, there's a lot more stories involving him, but he was kind of like God's top-tier soldier, for lack of a better word.
S-tier angel.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. And Suzan told James, "No, your name's not James. It's actually Michael, and this comes directly from God through her." She believes she's like divining information. So that night, she ended up inviting him to stay the night at her home. And he basically, he agreed, and he just never left after that. And soon they were married. And they bonded over their love of psychedelics and their conversations of philosophy and religion. And they were basically inseparable ever since then. Suzan soon convinced him that she was a psychic and that they were lovers in their past lives. Dating back to ancient Egypt and medieval Europe, every single instance of their past lives, they were always lovers. They found each other somehow, cosmically, right? In their spare time, the couple often smoked marijuana and tripped on psychedelic drugs, especially, as we mentioned, peyote. And Suzan would often share her visions with him. So peyote contains mescaline, which is a naturally occurring psychedelic that comes from various cacti plants from Mexico, Peru, and Ecuador. Like Josh, I think you were saying they kind of shave off the cactus plant.
The crown, the pieces of the crown of the cactus.
Yeah.
And then you can eat it just raw.
Right, yeah.
Or a lot of people will soak it in water and make like a tea out of it.
Yep. You can consume it in various ways, but its effects vary from person to person, depending on the dosage, set, and setting. Set is like your mindset. Your setting is your environment. So according to the Alcohol and Drug Foundation, or the ADF, mescaline affects all the senses, altering a person's thinking, sense of time, and emotions. Psychedelics can cause a person to hallucinate, seeing or hearing things that do not exist or are distorted. And the ADF also warns that, quote, people with a family history of mental illness are more likely to experience anxiety, paranoia, delusions, and psychosis after using mescaline. So keep that in mind as we go forward.
This episode of the podcast is brought to you by Fume, the world's first flavored air device that will help you quit those bad habits. We all know which ones they are.
Do you have any oral fixations, Josh? Do you ever get that? I totally have. I mean, I bet we could throw up a coffee sipping counter on the little corner of our screen up here, because I just constantly have to sip coffee whenever I'm feeling like it, or I'm at home. I got to be sipping on something. I feel like Fume kind of does the same thing to kind of just replace that incessant need to
stop drinking so much caffeine.
Yeah. Well, that's what I need to get on the Fume. I just forgot mine today, but and here I am with my coffee cup. There's nothing even in here.
Next week, though.
Next week,
fuming it up.
It's gonna be Fume. Yep, I promise.
I've been loving my Fume. I've had it for a while now, and it gives you all the same satisfaction that those bad habits used to give you. You know, here's a little ASMR for you. So this is the Fume flavored air device. It's really nice, honestly. It feels heavy in the hand.
Yeah, I like it.
It's well built. It's got real metal and wood, and it's got it's got fidgeting mechanisms to it. You can twist the top. Listen. Wow. And then you can slide it. Amazing.
Incredible.
Well, if you want to know what it is, basically, it's a device. It's supposed to mimic, what a vape used to do for you, without all the harmful chemicals and the vapor and all the bad stuff. And what's cool about it is they made this pods, these little flavor pods, and they come in a bunch of different flavors. They've got cinnamon hearts, peach blush. This is a crisp mint. I'm a big minty guy. And so you just get this little flavor pod and you put it inside of this device. There's no battery, there's no vapor, there's no mess. You just put it in there, slide it on.
Delicious.
Just delicious air.
Fume has already helped over 400,000 people take steps towards better habits. And now, you know what? It's your turn. To kick off the new year, use our code LIGHTSOUT to get a free gift with your journey pack. Head to tryfume.com. That's tryfum.com. Use code LIGHTSOUT to claim this limited time offer today.
I've personally never tried peyote, but from what I know from people who have done it, it's definitely a powerful psychedelic. Some people even compare it to LSD and its effects, and obviously it depends on how much you take. So we don't know how much they were taking, but it can definitely give you some crazy visuals, and the length of time can be 4 to 6 hours on average to even more, depending on what you're taking. But it's definitely hallucinogenic, so you can definitely see things that aren't there. And again, depending on your setting, it could be a really euphoric, happy experience, or it could be a terrifying experience, depending on also where your mind's at. And just in context of Suzan and James, or Michael,
right?
You can only imagine the things that they're talking about while they're doing these psychedelics. So I think that's a big part of it. I think one could sit here and blame the psychedelics for everything that happens after this, but I think it really comes back to we don't know if there's some type of mental illness that Michael's dealing with. Seems possible, but also what they're talking about. And
we already know James has been talking about assassinations, a violent overthrow of the government. He's threatened to kill people, so we do know he has these crazy violent tendencies.
Suzan's telling stories from Revelation.
Right. Yeah.
That's pretty crazy.
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to read that book.
Yeah. And so I don't know if you can kind of connect the dots here without even really knowing too much more about them. You can kind of see where this is heading.
Yeah. It's really odd because, as we kind of mentioned at the beginning, where these guys start and where they end is in two different places, but they seem to connect back to each other. Because my first sort of assumptions of Suzan is she's a very, one could say maybe she's kind of a hippie, but to me, she seems almost more of a witchy type person. So maybe she's kind of into divination and metaphysical concepts, kind of new age spirituality, but then there's some biblical stuff mixed in there.
Yeah, she's doing some like divination.
Mm-hmm.
She's a psych, or she's claiming she's a psychic
Or a channeler or something.
Right.
You know, she's got all these things going on. So you've got Michael, who's already kind of teetering on the edge, and then you got Suzan coming in, who's now a sexual partner for him, and now somebody likely that he's trusting to sort of guide him. She's older than him, so you kind of have a perfect storm brewing with the two of them. Is the best way.
And they're both into abusing psychedelics as well.
Right.
So yeah, it's a crazy storm of things happening.
Or some people use psychedelics as sort of a way to get these messages, and sort of part of the recipe for divination. But again, it's like it comes back to how you're doing them, the intention behind doing them, and
right.
And I don't think anybody would advise to do these on a regular basis.
Right.
Where you're never sort of able to come back to reality, to baseline, and be like, okay, we were tripping, we were on hallucinogens.
Yes.
Now we're back in reality. Let's sort of decompress.
Yeah.
Before we jump back into it.
And I don't think they're doing that, right? They're doing it where, I think this is more implied. It's never explicitly said, but what I think is happening, they trip. Suzan is saying, oh, I'm having these visions that then they're applying to the real world.
Yeah.
So they're not dividing the two between this is tripping and this is real life. They're saying, no, the things that we're experiencing during the trip is informing our reality. And I
never a good recipe for success by any means.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't want to, it's one thing to reflect and be like, okay, as long as we maintain, the context that was us hallucinating, experiencing psychedelics.
Right.
We are now back in the real world. Let's look at this with a logical state of mind, sober state of mind.
And you might be able to gather something interesting from those moments.
Absolutely.
But knowing these people, I don't think they're gathering the most enlightening or positive information from this.
Right. They're letting it create their reality and also reinforce their ideologies and and sort of fusing this, drug world with the real world. You know what I mean? Like they're becoming one and the same, to where they are not able to tell the two apart. And I've actually known people who have overused psychedelics to the point where they changed as like people, to where they were doing it, every day, every other day for a period of time, and it permanently changed them. And there's a lot of science behind it. I won't get into it, but he was also in that kind of 18 to 21 range when your brain's not fully developed, which is a big thing. So it can definitely
I think they
have
also
some major
say,
effects on it.
That's the time when like your mental illnesses start to reveal themselves is around the same time.
But it definitely, it just seemed like this person that I knew kind of lost touch with reality and just was very different from the version I knew before they started doing that. So you have to be, very careful.
Yeah, I knew two people back, same time frame. Yeah, never really came back from it. But that's a lot to unpack though, because there's a lot of factors that are also behind that. It's not explicitly just the psychedelic
the drugs. Right.
Yeah, right. There's a lot to break down from there.
Other factors that apply. And things that going on in people's lives.
Right.
But it's like creating that perfect storm. If you have all these other factors and then you take these and they may or may not help. In some cases, they can help those sort of pre-existing conditions, but in other ways, they can also make them 10 times worse.
Right.
So you just really don't know, and you have to be very careful with it, and kind of know what you're doing, or be with somebody you trust who knows what they're doing. But if you have two people who are just all in on it every single day, because they're looking for divine connection and guidance on how to proceed in life,
you get a little bit of folie à deux here. You get they're buying into each other's delusions a bit.
Exactly. Well, let's talk about Jenn, their daughter. Amazing human, by the way. She's done some interviews and some docuseries and stuff on her time with with her dad and stuff. And you can't even imagine what she's been through. Very strong individual. But when she was 4, which was at the time of their divorce, she would visit her father and Suzan on the weekends. And one of the first things that she knows was that her father had completely changed almost immediately once he started hanging out with Suzan. He was a once attentive and loving father, but then he began ignoring her. And James did eventually change his name legally to Michael. And so he seemed like he was a completely different man around Suzan as opposed to what she had experienced before. Jenn thought that she was dominant and controlling, and she even compared her to a Disney villain, which I think is a fair characterization.
Those were the scariest things as a kid, right?
Oh,
the
yeah.
Disney villains.
Cruella de Vil freaked me out as a kid, man.
So to compare someone to that, it's pretty enlightening of Jen's opinion.
Yeah, well, as a kid,
Suzan.
that's like the closest thing you can.
The worst, yeah.
Jenn even compared Suzan's living room to the haunted forest from The Wizard of Oz, and she was terrified while staying there. There was one particular time where Jenn asked her father for some water, and he just passed out in front of her. He was most likely strung out on some sort of substance. She then tried to move the kitchen chair so she could climb up and reach the food cupboards, but when she did, she discovered that there was no food in the house. So clearly not a home suitable for a child by any means, and two parents, guardians that should not be in possession or custody of a child at this point. There was another time she was so distressed that she used the rotary phone to dial 0 for the operator, and she asked for her mommy because she didn't know her mother's phone number. Suzan and Michael then spiraled deeper into madness. Michael recently developed a religious fanaticism. And Suzan claimed that she could tell who was a demon and that God spoke directly to her, which is, how many times have we heard this?
Yeah, right. That sounds very culty, doesn't it?
Yes. When somebody's like, I can tell if somebody's a demon and God told me so.
Yeah. Come on.
You gotta start wondering.
Mm-hmm.
She also had delusions that God was telling her to kill the demons.
So that's the seed right there.
Yep.
That kind of grows into the madness that follows here.
Here's a clip of Jenn talking about some of her experiences in the home.
And they were just instantly together. It was like a match and gasoline. It just exploded when they met. My first visit to their home was very strange. Instead of having furniture, they had like 100 potted trees or plants. I recall them being passed out high, naked on the only piece of furniture, which is a waterbed. I recall them not feeding me and trying to find food. I was crying and asking my daddy to rub my back the way that my mom did before bed. And I remember she said, "You want a back rub? I'll give you a back rub." She had these long kind of jaggedy nails, and she scratched on my back, and it just seared with pain.
Tells you a whole lot. I mean, imagine being a child going into your father's quote unquote home, right? And they're naked, passed out on the waterbed. There's fucking plants and trees everywhere. There's not even furniture in the house.
There's no food in the house.
A terrifying situation to be in. Yeah, I'm wondering what plants those were. I wonder if she was like growing her own peyote and
I wonder too, because you can
other
grow
substances.
What cactus? They need a lot of light, right? Not a lot of water.
Yeah,
and if they're in Arizona around this time,
probably could.
Yeah,
probably could. And then the encounter with Suzan, where Suzan's going to give her a back rub, ends up scratching her. Before that whole thing even happened, Suzan had whispered in Jenn's ear saying that she was a demon and that she was going to hell. Can't imagine a more fucked up thing to say to a child.
A 4-year-old.
Yeah. Suzan believed that Jenn was a threat to their ideologies and needed to be eliminated. Jenn later said this about Suzan, quote, "I've had glimpses of memories my whole life of her pushing me under bath water, like holding me under and I couldn't breathe. I'm in this house of horrors. She's not feeding me. She's telling me that I'm the devil. I'm going to go to hell. I deserve to die." Scary.
Yeah.
Lynn, her mother, soon learned about the abuse when Jenn returned home. and she told her that Michael and Suzan didn't feed her and that her back hurt. And when Lynn saw the fingernail scratches down her daughter's back, she said she tried to inform police and family members about what was actually going on over there, but they all treated her like a bitter ex-wife who wasn't getting her way after the divorce. Which this whole thing is very, I think all of us like, it's hard to believe, right? It's like, really? Nobody thought this was alarming? The police weren't alarmed by this?
Right.
It sounds like potentially the police just didn't take it seriously, or just kind of like, oh, it's just another divorce, which is weird. And again, I think the way they handle these domestic situations is different than probably how they would do it now. Maybe they would take it more serious now. Who knows? But yeah, it's all a little weird.
This episode of Lights Out is brought to you by Extract Labs. Extract Labs makes award-winning hemp products you can trust. They're clean, potent, and fully traceable from seed to bottle. They offer the largest selection of USDA organic certified CBD products on the market, including tinctures, gummies, pet products, and topicals. I myself love using the pet products for my dog Jerry. So if quality and purity matter to you, Extract Labs has you covered. And if you're watching your sugar intake, which you should be, check out their brand new sugar-free sleep gummies, formulated to help you wind down and get some better rest without the sugar crash.
So for all of our fans out there who, are great customers that we had over at Higher Love Wellness, I've probably said this before, but Extract Labs has officially partnered with Mile Higher, because Kendall and I are part owners of Extract Labs. And since they're already making, all of the Higher Love products behind the scenes, that is now Extract Labs, you'll get that same high quality formula and that you know and trust. So it's all really, really high quality stuff. They manufacture everything here in Colorado, which is cool. All of the CBD is extracted from Colorado hemp plants.
Nice.
So it's truly some of the best quality stuff. I've seen it go from seed to sale, to the end product. And, I can say with confidence, this is by far some of the best CBD products you'll be able to find out there. And they just have so many different things. I mean, they have CBD for every possible thing you could want, whether you have pain, inflammation, to sleep, to relaxation. If you're interested in Delta 8, which is a great alternative to marijuana. I mean, they've got the whole gambit. So whatever you're looking for when it comes to hemp, they've got you covered. And, because I'm a really nice guy, I'm here to give all of our Lights Out listeners 10% off with code LIGHTSOUT at extractlabs.com. And for a limited time, which you want to take advantage of this, when you spend $50 or more, you'll get a free bottle of those sugar-free sleep gummies.
Yum.
That's extractlabs.com. And don't forget to use code LIGHTSOUT for your discount and your free gummies. She then discovered through bizarre letters and phone calls from Michael that he and Suzan planned on leaving the country and traveling to a few different countries in Europe. And through these letters, Lynn also discovered their new disturbing religious beliefs and theories about demons and cleansing the world. And Michael told her that before he and Suzan would leave the country, they were coming to get Jenn. As a mother, absolutely terrifying. Michael told her to have her ready along with her passport before they arrived in about an hour.
So Lynn immediately knew something was off. She was instinctually worried that the couple was going to come and kill her, abduct Jenn, and then kill her as well. And at the time, this seemed drastic, but considering what will follow here in the story, Lynn's response to this would be completely reasonable. She took Jenn and went on the run, never staying anywhere for too long because she thought the deranged couple would come and find them and murder her and her daughter. 4-year-old Jenn was initially really angry about this move since she didn't understand what was going on. I mean, how could you? Especially you're so innocent at 4 years old. How could you even explain to a child?
You don't know what's going on at all.
Yeah. So she and Lynn would be on the run for about 5 years straight. And they first headed to Southern California, where they hoped to disappear into the large populated area. Lynn also had to give up her stable teaching job and a nice house that they had. She never clarified to Jenn that they were hiding from her father because she didn't want to scare her. I think that's a reasonable move. I don't know how you explain something like this to a child. So Lynn really only told her that her father was sick and he needed to get better. I think that's a very basic way to explain that to a 4-year-old. And while they were on the run, she coached Jenn on how to keep secrets, and she warned Jenn that they shouldn't even tell family members where they lived at any given time, fearing that that information could get back to Michael and Suzan. Jenn said, quote, "I got in the habit of keeping a lot of secrets and being very controlled with what I say or didn't say. And she learned how to avoid talking about her father's absence to her friends, and she would say things like, my father's just a roadie for the Grateful Dead, so he's on tour a lot." And she strategically chose that band, the Grateful Dead, because at that time they were constantly touring. That's what they're known for, a million live shows out there. So it was smart. She always had an excuse for where her father was. Oh, the Grateful Dead's on tour. That's where my dad is. Don't really ask me questions about it.
Yeah, I couldn't have picked a better cover for that, for sure. But meanwhile, Michael and Suzan headed overseas for about a year, but they eventually ran out of money. And it sounded like Suzan she wasn't poor. She definitely had some money, but they went through that money pretty quickly once they got overseas. So they actually came back to the United States, and Michael immediately tried to contact Jenn by sending letters to relatives, hoping that they would eventually find their way to his daughter. And luckily, they never did. Meanwhile, Michael was only getting worse, and now both he and Suzan changed their last name to Bear, like B-E-A-R, like the animal. According to Jenn, her father always identified with bears and saw them as kind of a totem. Lynn had also called him Bear as a nickname when they were married. They made what little money they had by selling weed, and their radical views got even crazier in the years that followed. They became vegetarians and radical environmentalists. They also claimed that they were now Muslim, but their beliefs were all half-baked, and they never really aligned with the Muslim faith. They picked and chose what they wanted, creating their own version of this new sort of religious philosophy they followed. But they combine elements of Islam with mysticism, which there's some of that in there, but generally it's probably considered incompatible with one another. But even though Michael had once accepted the pacifist nature of the hippie movement, he now fully embodied violence as a way of improving the world. And, he's ready to carry out a religious holy war. Michael and Suzan wanted to wage war on those they deemed impure. They liked the concept of jihad, but they took the idea and targeted whoever they wanted, just like Suzan did with Michael's daughter. And as they traveled, they continued to develop a strange moral code whenever it would benefit them. They soon hitchhiked up and down the Pacific coast looking for work and like-minded people, and they ended up in San Francisco in the Haight-Ashbury neighborhood where the hippie movement had boomed in the 60s and 70s, but by the early 80s, the movement had mostly passed. Drug use was still common, but the energetic counterculture movement had definitely toned down a bit. It was definitely starting to fizzle out. The neighborhood had become more middle class, but still held on to grassroots organizations and supported small businesses.
I do find it funny that they're hitchhiking and trying to find like-minded people. Are you going to find like-minded people? Because your guys' views are way outside of the box here.
And I am curious on where their knowledge on Islam came from.
I think really it was just jihad that drew them to the faith. As much as I could find, it sounded like they just wanted to
read the Quran.
No, I highly doubt it. Highly doubt it.
Because I think they would see it's clearly not about that,
Because, those who know very little about Islam will definitely go to, but the jihad. You're like, well, all right. I guess there's not much of a conversation to be had here.
No,
right?
no.
So while in Haight-Ashbury, Suzan and Michael bought and sold drugs to make some money. And through these connections, they actually made a friend, 23-year-old Keryn Barnes. And this is no relation to Suzan. Suzan also shares the last name Barnes, or she did before she married Michael. So Keryn was from Georgia and was described as bohemian and artistic, and she had moved to California to pursue a career in acting. And she even landed a small role in Burt Reynolds' sleeper hit, Smokey and the Bandit. Classic movie. Apparently, on set, Burt told her that, she had what it took to make it in Hollywood. But it didn't really end up working out for her. She eventually landed a job as Jane Fonda's housekeeper, which is kind of cool. and she later moved to San Francisco, where she met Michael and Suzan in the early 1980s. They all bonded over their love of art, religion, and philosophy, and she became their first indoctrinated follower. Although Keryn's friends had warned her not to hang out around Suzan and Michael, she was already too deeply invested in their beliefs. So Keryn then rented a basement apartment in San Francisco with Social Security payments, and she invited Suzan and Michael to live with her. The three of them then lived together for a short while, and it soon became obvious that Michael was attracted to Keryn. So Suzan, as you would expect, became very jealous, and she began plotting immediately. She told Michael that because of her psychic energy, she was vulnerable to witches, and when she was around witches, she could feel her energy and powers being drained. And she then convinced Michael that Keryn was obviously a witch.
Because she's attractive.
Yeah. So,
and a nice person that people gravitate towards.
Yeah, exactly.
Sounds like she's the witch.
No, seriously.
Which is so bizarre about this whole thing. I'm like,
I know. I don't know what. Yeah, it's very odd. I don't think they really understand.
I don't think they get anything.
No, I don't think they get it. So if you can see this going forward, this is how Suzan operates. She finds someone she doesn't like, and then tells Michael, hey, she's a witch. She needs, and if we want to carry out this holy war and take out the witches, well, we got to kill them. Then that's basically how they operate. It's a very simple system that they have here.
Which also shows she was very good at manipulating Michael.
Very good. Yeah.
She knew how to control him.
As evidenced by Jenn visiting their house and seeing that, her father had completely changed, by the time from her parents' divorce, and then all of a sudden seeing her father again, completely different. Not to say that Suzan is the mastermind, quote unquote, because I think Michael does take a lot of responsibility here for his actions.
Yeah, and his past also, makes you get to that point where you're like, yeah, he was violent before and now he's violent again.
Right.
But you do have this person who he believes is divine in some way.
Yeah.
And special. And so he feels obligated to follow the things that she says.
Yeah. And now that he's obsessed with this holy war thing, she knows how to pull his strings like a puppet.
Right.
So yeah, she ended up just tying in this, obsession with a holy war against evil. And now that the Bears believed that their main targets were witches, Michael felt the need to be Suzan's protector, because if her psychic energy is being drained, obviously they have to murder Keryn. Meanwhile, Keryn could kind of sense that something had changed with her roommates and their behaviors had gotten weirder. She told family and friends that she felt increasingly threatened living with them, and her feelings, unfortunately, about them would soon be proven right.
Because on March 6, 1981, Keryn was in the kitchen when Michael and Suzan ambushed her. Michael bashed her over the head with a frying pan. This did not kill her, and he hesitated after the blow. Keryn had fallen to the floor, and Suzan noticed Michael's hesitation, so she grabbed a paring knife to finish what they started. She began stabbing Keryn. Michael then snapped out of it, grabbed the paring knife from Suzan, and also began stabbing Keryn. She ended up dying with 13 stab wounds to the face and throat, causing her to be partially decapitated, and her skull had been broken by the frying pans. Just absolutely brutal way to die. Suzan and Michael then wrapped her in a blanket and hid the body. Other reports claim her body was left in the kitchen, but then the Bears just fled the area. The next day, Keryn's body was discovered and police suspected she had been killed by someone she knew. And when they found out that Suzan and Michael had been her roommates, and they were now missing, they put two and two together and realized, oh, these are probably our prime suspects here in this murder case. The problem was that the police didn't know them by their legal names since they were going by Michael and Suzan Bear. And also it just seems like police definitely didn't prioritize this case. But the Bears had convinced themselves that they had followed the will of God by engaging in a holy war and ridding the world of an evil witch. But really, all they had done was murder an innocent victim because of Suzan's jealousy. Their delusion continued from here, and their holy war wasn't over yet. They also began to believe that, quote, homosexuality and abortion were causes for death, They convinced themselves that they were doing morally good acts for God, and they soon had the urge to cleanse the world of all witches. So,
oh boy. So meanwhile, Lynn was living in a constant state of paranoia, probably for good reason, knowing that this is happening. She and her daughter, Jenn, couch surfed with friends and relatives, always on the move. And many asked, why did they live like this? When Lynn would try to explain to them about her ex-husband and his new partner and their crazy ideologies, many thought that Lynn was just overreacting, and nobody really believed that Lynn and Jenn were in real danger.
Which is very unfortunate.
Yeah.
But I could see how it could happen. I mean, it's so fucking crazy that part of you is like, what?
Right, yeah.
There's no way.
Yeah, it's one of those things, hindsight 2020, right? Because, yeah, if someone just like escapes and like, oh, my husband's a religious fanatic and he's trying to, kill people, cleanse the world, I'd be like, what? I don't know who would I
doesn't
would
seem
even
as crazy
believe
these
that.
days.
Right, yeah, true.
We're very desensitized to a lot of this, and nothing really shocks us anymore. But I could see how at that time period, maybe people would have been like, huh? Really? Susan's doing that?
Yeah. And these are potentially people who knew James, like when he was maybe a attentive father, a gentle husband, that was maybe people who had seen James in the past. Because I know that some of the family members, unnamed, still had connections to James, or Michael, as we've been calling him, because that's how he was sending like the letters trying to reach Jenn. So I guess there was still a connection there at some point. I don't know how close they were, but I could see how that would be odd if someone all of a sudden was like, no, he's insane. But it's like, no, I remember him. I saw him a few years ago and he was fine.
Which lends to Jenn's observation that her father changed almost immediately.
Right.
It was such a drastic change that there just wasn't even enough time for people to have the opportunity to witness and experience this new version of him.
Yeah, that's a good
at this point. And so, by all accounts, according to his own daughter, totally different guy.
Yeah.
Before meeting Susan.
Yeah.
And prior to that.
Right.
So I can see how this played out. And also just the time period, just different. This would have been just such a wild thing to make the news, right? People would be shocked. They'd be like, what? That's just insane.
Yeah.
I mean, nowadays it's like local news on Thursday night,
right.
Yeah. Man in Florida.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
This is common now, but maybe it wasn't, but I think it was definitely. It's unfortunate because if people had listened and taken it seriously, maybe, some of this could have been prevented.
True. But while they were on the run and couch surfing, money was also tight because Lynn did not want to work where she would have to present a social security card because she was still paranoid that, somehow if she was a documented employee that the Bears would somehow find them. So she took low-paying jobs that offered cash, sometimes 3 to 4 at a time, and she tried her best to raise her daughter while keeping her hidden from the Bears. Luckily, Susan and Michael weren't any closer to finding them because for the next year, they traveled up and down the Pacific Coast Highway. I think it's, also known as Highway 1, eventually landing in Oregon, and they stayed in Grants Pass for a while before heading down the coast. By May 1982, they found work on a marijuana farm in Alder Point, California.
Humboldt County, baby.
Yep, Humboldt County. Michael worked security there, and he was even given a rifle to protect the property. And soon his coworkers became worried about Susan and Michael's behavior. According to some of the workers, the Bears were anarchists who wanted a violent overthrow of the government. They also prophesized a nuclear war, which would lead to an apocalypse in the near future. And this guy is the guy with the gun on the property.
Yeah. Which doesn't surprise me that much because if you know anything about Humboldt County, if you've ever seen the Netflix documentary Murder Mountain.
Oh, is that in Humboldt
They're
County?
actually mentioned, I believe.
Really?
These guys are part of what made Murder Mountain.
Really?
The fact that Mr. Michael Bear worked there.
Whoa.
Because this is an area where a lot of illegal marijuana grows are.
Sure.
I want to say there's There's definitely organized crime running through there. I think even cartels notorious in there, but there's a lot of murders, unsolved murders and disappearances of people up there.
Even today with it being
Yes.
like legalized?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah, it's still an issue up there.
That's wild.
So just a little tidbit. Definitely watch that if you haven't seen it. But one day, Suzan got into a disagreement with another worker, 26-year-old Clark Stevens, on how to properly manicure the marijuana plants, because it's you got to be very particular about how you do it. But an intense argument followed, which escalated as the minutes passed. Clark was known to have a pretty abrasive personality and would always stand up for himself. Following the argument, Suzan deemed that Clark was a witch and needed to die, and Michael agreed without hesitation. Just shows you how deep in it he was.
Mm-hmm.
So on one of the days that followed, we don't know exactly what that date was, it just was within the next couple of days, Michael and Suzan found Clark alone on the farm. None of the other workers were nearby, and Michael went up to Clark, aimed the rifle that he was given for his security job, and shot Clark in the head, which killed him instantly. Suzan and Michael then carried his body out to a field on the farm and doused him in accelerant. They burned the body and buried what was left under a pile of manure. Then the bearers immediately fled the property. They had no vehicle and very little money, so they tried to hitchhike on the side of the road in Trinity County in Northern California. And while trying to find a ride, they noticed a long line of police cars in the distance coming toward them. The bears figured they had finally been caught, so they started screaming. They dropped their bags and ran in different directions deep into the woods. As it turned out, the police units were only looking for a hiker that had just gone missing. But since the couple appeared so suspicious by running away, the police pulled over to where the couple had dropped their bags, and some officers even tried to follow the couple into the woods but didn't have any luck finding them. Others checked the bags that they had dropped, and when they opened the bags, they discovered a handgun, several fake IDs, and a bizarre manifesto titled "A Cry for War." How dumb.
Dude, I know. It's kind of like Scooby-Doo.
But good thing they did this.
Yeah, right. I know. I'm glad
They're so
because this is
dumb.
how they get caught. Yeah. Can you imagine how stupid they must have looked?
Like, oh shit, cops.
Yeah. Scatter. Yeah, it's so stupid. So Michael had penned this manifesto, A Cry for War, and he called for a violent revolution to overthrow the U.S. government. We've heard this before from him. But this included, specific targeted bombings and political assassinations, and he also prophesied the impending nuclear war, as he had done with his coworkers. A lot of the writings were gibberish and very poorly written, and just like Suzan and Michael's religious ideologies, the political ideologies were also just violent and half-baked. Much of the writings tried to defend and justify the murders they had committed, and they detailed their large-scale plan of wiping out witches. And they even had a list of the witches that needed to be eliminated. So here's my favorite part. This list included Johnny Carson, the famous late night host, beloved. Although it's not exactly clear why he might have been targeted. I tried to understand why he was really in there. A lot of publications didn't even bother to expound upon this, but he might have been targeted because he had invited several mentalists and psychics onto the show, including the amazing Kreskin. And he had actually gone on the show 88 times. Johnny Carson would also play the comedic role of Karnak the Magnificent, who was a quote-unquote mystic from the East who would psychically divine answers.
Which was just a bit.
It's just a bit. Like, clearly, if you watch this, it's comedy, and there's nothing to it. Now, the amazing Kreskin was a little bit more convincing in his abilities, but as far as like Johnny Carson's, if you even look at pictures of him, it's just being a goofball. But others on the list included then California Governor Jerry Brown and then President Ronald Reagan. In the manifesto was a very detailed plan on how they planned to assassinate the president, and Suzan had claimed that God told her that these men were high priority targets. Allegedly, Michael had written down their names while Suzan spoke about them in her psychic trances.
Which don't they not want the cops to find this?
It's so stupid.
Fastest way to get caught. Write a manifesto about assassinating the president that the police didn't read.
Yeah.
You know who's going to be knocking at your door now? Like, dude.
Right, exactly. This case will, as you kind of see where this is headed, this is going to get bumped up to the federal level because you're planning on assassinating the president.
Secret Service is 1,000%. FBI is going to look at this.
I also love that they're like panicking and they're like, oh, immediately drop the bags that include all the evidence they need to detain us.
Right.
So stupid. So as for the fake IDs that we mentioned that were recovered from that bag, Michael had been using the driver's license of a man named Richard Arata. And since police couldn't find them after they scattered, that was really the only name that they had to go on for now.
But 2 weeks after Michael had shot Clark Stevens, the police were called to the marijuana farm. Witnesses had seen what they first thought was the farm dog carrying a large ball in its mouth. But once the dog got close enough, they realized the dog had discovered a human skull. Police searched the area until they discovered the rest of the buried, charred remains. Workers then mentioned that when Clark Stevens went missing, Michael and Suzan Bear had suspiciously taken off around the same time. Authorities identified the victim as Clark, and Michael and Suzan immediately became suspects. But still, just like in the other jurisdictions, police didn't know the couple's legal names. Suzan and Michael Bear did not come up in their database since their names were Suzan Carson. Her former name was Suzan Barnes, and Michael Carson was formerly James. They also couldn't identify them through any fingerprints recovered from items in the bag, and they were long gone from the area as the days passed. The Bears had been separated since the day they saw the police cars, but they had previously planned to hitchhike and meet back up in a safe house in LA if they ever got split up. While hitchhiking near LA, Michael was recognized on the side of the road by a man who had worked on the marijuana farm with him. And knowing that Michael was a suspect in the murder of Clark, the man then called the police. A police officer was dispatched to the area, but the officer confused Michael for a different suspect who was wanted for another crime. Michael almost perfectly matched the description of another man police were looking for over a sexual assault in a nearby city. Either way, he was able to get Michael into custody and take him back to the station. But the officer had failed to frisk Michael, and Michael was able to hide his handgun in the back of the police car.
Oh, God.
And when they got back to the station, Michael claimed that his name was Richard Arata. Again, he has that fake ID. And he also claimed he had done nothing wrong and had nothing to hide. And while questioned, he acted polite and insisted that there is nothing going on. You have the wrong guy. I'm just a hitchhiking Richard Arata. Meanwhile, there's a gun.
Right, I know. That they missed.
How do you mess that up, man? It happens, I guess.
Yeah.
Police then took a picture of Michael and showed it to the sexual assault victim. She insisted that he wasn't the guy. So Michael was set free.
Oof.
Big miss.
Yeah.
Soon after, police were baffled when they found a gun in the back of the patrol car. I'm sure that officer was so fucking thankful that something, because if he could have just shot the officer in the back of the head.
True.
He could have been murdered.
Mm-hmm.
Oh man, that's every officer's worst nightmare is to not find a gun on somebody.
God, I would resign if I was that officer, though. That would scare me way too much, first of all, and knowing that I screwed up that bad, I'd just be like, you know what, maybe this isn't for me.
I could have been killed. He could have killed one of my buddies at the state. I mean,
yeah,
because it happens. There's crazy videos of when officers don't find guns on people and then they end up killing people at the station or the officer. It's so important.
Yeah, that was they somehow dodged a disaster there.
My guess is Michael's just convincing enough. Like, oh yeah, I'm just hitchhiking. I'm Richard Arata.
Yep.
He probably ran and was like, oh, there's nothing there. So harmless.
Yeah. Which is scary that he could still, even as deranged as this guy is, the fact that he can still put on a good face and trick police officers is really scary. But meanwhile, Michael, now that he was free, he met back up with Suzan since, they had planned to meet back up in LA. And police then ran the name Richard Arata through their database. I'm not sure why they didn't do this when they had him in custody, but they did it after. And the name came up with an alert from Trinity County in Northern California. And here police noted that the name was found on an ID in a bag abandoned on the side of the road. that included a violent manifesto from a suspect who was on the run. Police then identified the suspect in Trinity County with the photo that LA police had taken of the alleged assault suspect. And meanwhile, Michael's violent manifesto, as we were saying earlier, had been passed on to federal authorities. And since the manifesto had declared Ronald Reagan an assassination target, the Secret Service had become involved. And when reviewing notes taken while police had questioned Michael, or, as they knew him as Richard, they noticed he had given police the name of his wife's ex-husband. Authorities then contacted the ex-husband who was in Scottsdale, Arizona, and he mentioned that his ex-wife's name was Suzan Barnes, and her new husband's name was James or Michael Carson. So federal agents finally had the suspects' legal names for the first time, although local police had just let Michael free. Meanwhile, at the place Lynn and Jenn were living at the time in 1982, 2 Secret Service agents knocked on their door, and Lynn was shocked and asked, how did you track me and my daughter down? We've been in hiding. And according to Jenn, who is now about 8 years old, the agents kind of started laughing and they said, we're the Secret Service. We can find anybody, which I think is hilarious and probably true. Lynn sent Jenn over to her room, but she kind of listened in through her door and heard some of the conversation that they had. She knew it had involved her father, who was in trouble, and the agents asked Lynn to describe her ex-husband, how they met, how long they were married, and his last known address. Then they thoroughly asked what his political beliefs were and if she had ever heard him mention killing any public officials, which we know she had. And they told Lynn that her ex-husband and his new wife were murder suspects and being investigated for a, quote, substantial threat. Lynn told them about Michael's violent nature and radical beliefs, and she figured, she kind of put 2 and 2 together since it's the Secret Service here at my door. Her ex-husband, who she knew as James Carson, now Michael Bear, must have made a serious threat against the president. I mean, you could kind of put that together, which would be such a surreal moment. And also a very validating moment to be like, I knew that there was something off about this guy. And we've been on the run for 5 years. And now that must have been a relief to her to be like, I made the right call.
Move. Yeah. Kudos to her, man.
Yeah.
For taking it seriously. And
right.
Because who knows what could happen.
Right.
I mean, so all it would take is Suzan say, she's a witch.
Yep. And she already did say that she was a demon, right?
Yep.
For Jenn. So
the fact that Michael just instantly killed anybody,
right,
who she called a witch is just crazy.
That's a big question that I thought of, though. Do you think Suzan could have convinced Michael to kill his own daughter?
Yes.
You think so?
I think he's in deep, deep, absolutely living in this delusion, and she's got him completely convinced.
Yeah, I think so too, which is terrifying.
It is. Well, around the same time, Michael and Suzan are on the run. They're trying to get away. They're hitchhiking. When they ended up catching a ride with a 30-year-old man named John Hellier in Bakersfield, about 100 miles north of LA. John had been in the process of moving things between properties and offered them a ride, and little did he know. While in the pickup truck, Suzan and Michael turned violent after Suzan accused John of touching her in an inappropriate way. Privately, Suzan whispered to Michael that John was a powerful witch who needed to die. Michael didn't need any more convincing than that, and a fight then broke out inside the pickup truck while John was driving. John pulled out a gun to defend himself, but Michael was able to get control of the weapon. Then Michael pointed the gun at John's head while Suzan screamed at Michael to shoot him. John then slammed on the brakes and scrambled out of the vehicle on a gravel lot beside the road. The 2 men then fought over the gun for a moment, with Michael gaining control of it, and then he shot John in the head in full daylight with cars passing by on the road. I mean, this incident alone just tells me that they were absolutely capable of killing Jenn, and
they're completely deranged.
They're just completely out of their fucking minds.
Mm-hmm.
The Bears then took the pickup truck with Suzan behind the wheel and fled the scene. Police were able to catch up to them as they were going at speed in excess of 100 miles per hour, and Suzan soon lost control of the vehicle drove into a ditch, and crashed the truck. When police detained the couple who were unharmed, Suzan was bragging about how good her driving was. Just,
What?
again, out of their fucking minds. Dude.
Right.
These guys are on a different level.
Yeah.
She was saying things like, quote, "That was all me. My old man couldn't drive that good." What?
Yeah.
Lady, you just crashed.
Do you think they're high right now?
Yes.
Yeah, that was the first thing I
I think
of.
they're high
all
the
day.
time,
Yeah.
all night.
Mm-hmm.
They're living in a
Serious.
different plane of existence from the rest of us. And who even knows what they're on at this point?
Right.
Because I'm like, they really had just psychedelics like on them at all times, or are they picking up other stuff?
They seem like they'd probably just do whatever they could get their hands on.
But news of their arrest eventually reached Lynn, and she met Jenn when school let out for the day. Jenn normally walked home, but Lynn came to walk with her, and Lynn reminded her of how her father had been, quote unquote, very sick. Jenn immediately thought the conversation was odd because for years, talking about her father seemed like it was forbidden. But Lynn explained that her father had gotten even more sick, and that he hurt many people and was going to jail so other people could be safe. Lynn and Jenn then walked home hand in hand, crying together, and they walked in silence for the rest of the way home. Jenn recalled seeing how sad her mother was and never wanted to see her mother cry that much ever again. I think that really just puts into perspective that it's sad because people are being hurt.
Right.
Her father's killing people, but also that her father's going to go away.
Right.
And the, kind of starting the mourning process of the father she once knew. And then he's changed. He's this completely different person, deranged, and life's going to be different from here on out.
Yeah. And she grappled with this. You could argue she's still kind of grappling with this if you see her in more modern interviews. But really, after this moment, Jenn realized she just never wanted to bother her mother with the subject again because she had seen her so traumatized. So she ended up trying to deal with it on her own. And, at only 9 years old, she really struggled to deal with this trauma. And she began believing that every adult was a potential killer. She later said, quote, "The whole world terrified me. I also feared that I would grow up and kill people." Yeah. That's awful. She even began sleeping with knives and scissors under her pillow in bed, afraid that she would be attacked in the night. And she soon began to struggle with suicidal ideation for about a year after her father was arrested. She eventually came across a newspaper article that her mother had kept that detailed her father's horrific crimes. And she does talk about this in a later interview that we'll play. And Jenn really began to compartmentalize her father's personality. To her, they were basically two people in her mind. There was James Carson, who was her loving, caring father, and then there was Michael Bear, who was a deranged serial killer. And another disturbing aspect of this is that her father continued to write to Jenn while he was incarcerated. This guy just does not get it. She never once responded to him. She hasn't read the majority of all the letters that he's ever sent her over the years. So he addressed the letters to a relative, but he was really writing them to Jenn, as he had been doing before. And this unnamed relative thought it was best for Jenn to have contact with her father, which there's a lot of complications there. But Jenn described it as getting letters from, quote, "the boogeyman." And every time she held these letters, she thought, these letters are from a serial killer. It really freaked her out. The letters were often jumbled and rambling and just in an odd stream of consciousness, and they just really creeped her out. And here's actually an interview with Jenn from a few years ago explaining, what she thinks actually happened to her father. It's interesting hearing this straight from her.
I always describe it as the Titanic. So we all know that there were 12 factors that sunk the Titanic, right? And so with my father, he had some of those predictors, a long early childhood illness and, and so on. But I think it was the perfect storm. I think it was an untreated mental illness, long-term use of psychedelic drugs, LSD, and also involvement with, a really obsessive, individual, his second wife. And then also, I believe that he's a psychopath. 1% of the population are psychopaths. Some of them become serial killers. Some become politicians.
I should say for the record, you haven't had any medical diagnoses in your case.
Tell it like it is. But some become internet trolls. So, 1% of the population lacks human empathy and the ability to have remorse. And so I see those traits in my father.
I'm glad she's able to talk about it with some humor.
Yeah, I like that too.
Yeah, she seems to have a great attitude considering all things. And it seems like, she's had a lot of time to sort of come to terms with the reality of things.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously as an adult, be able to understand the complex mental health situation here. The mention of him being a psychopath seems on point to me.
Yeah.
But yeah, I like the
jab.
Yeah.
This was during Trump's first term. So
yeah, that's funny.
Resounding applause.
Yeah. But I think she sums it up pretty good. I think it's clear that he's suffering from some form of mental illness, but then, the psychedelics just, you kind of, enhance those and those conditions. And and then not only that, he's with somebody who's backing up all these delusions and, somebody who he clearly has entrusted a lot of himself to and identifies a lot of himself with. And so I think, I keep saying the perfect storm, but that's really the term for this.
I like the way she put it. She says like, everyone knows there's like 12 factors that sunk the Titanic. And it's good to remind yourself there's no single thing or even like a few things that you can point to. It's usually a lot of factors coming into play.
Absolutely. Michael and Suzan were charged with the murder of John Hellier, and while in jail waiting trial, Michael wrote a letter to the San Francisco Chronicle, which was a newspaper that the Zodiac Killer famously often wrote to. Wonder if that's just coincidence that he did that, or if that was sort of a part of the plan, so to speak.
Yeah.
Michael said, quote, "How many people do we have to kill to get attention?" Michael and Suzan desperately wanted to spread their ideologies in the media spotlight, but they refused to confess anything to police from jail. They even refused to speak to their appointed lawyers, which was rare. So they negotiated with authorities to get a press conference where they could speak about their crimes. At the press conference, the Bears spent 5 hours explaining their bizarre religion and philosophies. They labeled themselves as pacifists and vegetarian yoga practitioners who converted to a form of Islam. They called themselves vegetarian Moslem warriors. And they also bragged about how successful they were in killing witches.
Yeah.
What?
Because we're pacifists and we kill people. What are you talking about, man? Yeah, it makes no sense.
5 hours though? They let them go for 5 hours?
Dude,
That's a mistake.
Man.
The hell?
I think it was more like, how much can we get out of them? Because obviously the prosecutors are like, just let them run their mouths. If they're not confessing in jail, maybe we can just get them to leak everything out here. But man, imagine having to sit through that for 5 hours.
Yeah.
Absolute misery.
Wonder what the guy behind the camera thought.
I'm going to take a smoke break.
Yeah.
I'm leaving it on. I'll be back.
Oh, the poor guy transcribing it too.
Oh man. Oh man.
But maybe this was a smart move. Maybe this was the right way to they're not talking to anybody else. They want their 5 hours of fame. So let's just give it to them.
Not even their lawyers, which blows my mind.
Just so far gone.
Yeah.
It's like
very
hard to even comprehend.
Mm-hmm.
In the conference without their lawyers, they confessed to all 3 murders: Keryn Barnes, Clark Stevens, and John Hellier. If they had not confessed, the murder of Keryn Barnes would most likely never have been solved, since police had not connected them to it. So,
if you remember,
one positive there.
They didn't have their names. They were like, it was her roommates, Michael and Suzan. They had no idea who they were.
Suzan said on the microphone, quote, "Now, Michael, we're only going to talk about the ones in California." they had also become suspects in a dozen more homicides. The media soon labeled them as the San Francisco witch killers. So he even knows if there
could be way
others
more
out there.
Yeah.
That's crazy. I mean, they were all up and down the Pacific Coast Highway
for years.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's very possible because, I mean, just thinking about how quickly these things unfolded, it's very possible.
Oh, yeah. And
They
have
encountered other people.
We don't even really know. It was undocumented what they had been in Oregon for a long time. We have no idea what
they
really
even did
were doing.
there.
Yeah, exactly.
God.
So, yeah.
Before their trials in 1984, the couples withdrew their confessions and pled not guilty. Good move.
Yeah.
Finally listening to the lawyers here. Oh, yeah, the 5 hours, just fucking flush it down the toilet.
Too little, too late at this point.
My God. Yeah. So, of course, this trial, they're making it crazy. The media is blowing it up. San Francisco witch trial. But the couple's defense claimed that they were being psychically attacked. That's what caused them to murder. The expert witnesses called by the defense were witches and warlocks who claimed that psychic attacks were possible.
Yep.
Oh, man.
Look, if you believe in this stuff or not, fine. But if you're going to try and bring this to a court of law,
that you're being psychically attacked, which is leading you to murder people.
Yeah.
Sorry, nobody's going to believe that, man.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, Michael and Suzan were caught making out at the defendant's table.
Mm-hmm.
Which, why were they allowed to sit at the defendant's table together, for one?
It's so romantic that they did it
Maybe
at
it was
the defendant's table. Maybe they didn't get to see each other that often or something. They were being held in separate, jail cells. So stupid.
But luckily, by June 1984, the couple was easily convicted of the murder of Keryn Barnes, and they were both sentenced to 25 years in prison. The following trials also convicted them for the murders of Clark Stevens and John Hellier. At the time, there was a moratorium on the death penalty in California, so they received additional sentences for the two murders, adding 25 years for each conviction, making it 50 and then 75 years to life in prison. These convictions were later upheld by the First District Court of Appeal. Thank God.
Yeah, seriously.
They got at least life.
Yep. What a ridiculous... it's so sad because it's like, man, these people were murdered by the most ridiculous people ever. And that kind of adds... It's just salt in the wound. It's just these idiots, these bumbling idiots. But yeah, so if we shift back over to Jenn, because she's a big part of this, she tried to move on with her life, but she couldn't really shake the fact that her father was a convicted serial killer and that she was, quote, a bad seed since she was his offspring. This kind of reminds me a little bit, not to get too into it, but you remember the BTK case, right?
Yeah.
And her daughter went through a lot of trying to forgive him and have a relationship with him, but then coming to terms with this guy is crazy and is manipulating me. And I always think of that story. It must be really hard for the children of these terrible people. How do you even begin to understand how someone does something like this? Although in 1984, her mother did end up meeting a man named Michael Gonzalez, and this would be her future stepfather. And this guy really helped turn her life around. She called him, quote, the Knight on the White Horse. And he found Jenn counseling and signed her up for Girl Scouts and church choir. He gave her some stability and a consistent routine, and Jenn then began excelling in school. And she also found emotional stability through her teacher, Mrs. Sylvia Case, who inspired her love of reading. There's a cute, you go look it up, there's a cute reunion that they had, and Jenn kind of got to express how much that teacher impacted her at a point when she was just really struggling. But although she was more stable now, with her stepfather's guidance and extracurriculars, Jenn really struggled for years with what her bio father had done. And here's Jenn talking about finally visiting her father in prison.
I was working as a school teacher. It was my first year of teaching. And I had an incident where I fell asleep in front of my classroom. And the reason is I've had a lifelong struggle with nightmares. I had come in contact with articles about my father's murders very soon after I was told. And I couldn't read all the words. I didn't know a D word and a B word. I now know it was decapitate and bludgeon. But I figured out the other words. And so immediately after those articles, I started struggling with nightmares. And so I wouldn't sleep. And so here I am. I'm an adult. I'm a school teacher, and I'm falling asleep in front of my class.
You decided to go see him.
I decided to go see him. I said, I'm going to confront him. I'm going to try to seek some closure here. And so the next day, I drove to Folsom Prison. And I, in my head, was ready for this visit with glass and a phone. And so I was all ready. And I went, and it was open visitation. So the door opened, and this man came up and hugged me. And I was so jarred. And then I turned, and all of a sudden, I saw someone I recognized, and this man was winking at me and smiling at me and being flirtatious. And I went, "Is that Eric Menendez?"
Oh my God.
And I'm like, what is happening?
What
like,
world
is this weird? You know.
That's surprising that they just had open visitation like that.
Yeah.
For somebody like
With a violent murderer. Yeah.
Maybe he's been on his best behavior in prison.
Yeah, right.
I don't know. Yeah, it's wild though.
Very weird. But after that visit, Jenn could now understand what her mother once felt like after dealing with someone with unbridled rage, as she called it, because her father then started sending her countless harassing and threatening letters to the point where she had to request a restraining order against him. And things only got worse by 2014, nearly 30 years after the murders, because the state had dropped the other cases that were potentially tied to the Bears. If you remember, there was potentially a dozen other cases, but they dropped them because they figured, the couple was already serving 75 years to life in prison for the 3 convictions. So
why bother?
Right. It's
Which
like
is such
they'll be
a
there forever.
Cop-out thing.
It is.
Which I get it. The courts are overloaded and they're
Right.
like, well, we're not going to expend more resources on this. But still, especially in California, man.
Yeah, and it turned out this kind of, it hasn't backfired yet, but it turned out that, they kind of thought they, locked the door, threw away the key.
Right.
But it turned out this wasn't necessarily the case because reforms in the California prison system gave them new opportunities for parole hearings. California's elder parole program put over 60 inmates who have served more than 25 years in jail up for parole. If an inmate is denied parole at their initial hearing, their next parole consideration hearing will be scheduled either 3, 5, 7, 10, or 15 years in the future. So obviously news got out about this. This was big news in California because this meant that this couple was now up for a parole hearing. Here's a short news clip of Rosemarie Stevens. This is Clark Stevens' stepmother responding to even just the potential parole. Very short clip, but here's Rose.
They should never be allowed to be out. They were barbaric the way they killed the three young people they killed that we know of, and there are probably more, they thought.
That's scary thinking that this could be a possibility. But for their first parole hearing, it was scheduled in 2015, Jenn chose to fight her father's potential parole. She was and still is certain that if he would be released, he would kill again. She has spoken to the victims' family members who would not feel safe if he was released. And in May 2015, Michael's hearing was postponed. And in June, Michael Carson wrote the parole board saying that he was waiving his right to a hearing for 5 years. And he wrote, quote, "No one is going to parole me because I will not and have not renounced my beliefs."
Oh, so there you go.
Yeah.
Yeah. Keep his ass in.
Right.
He hasn't changed at all. He doesn't deserve to come out.
Yeah. And at least he's self-aware, I guess. He realizes that he's I haven't changed. He really
believes in this stuff.
Yeah.
That's the scary thing.
That is
he really
believes.
Scary.
Yeah.
That he's out there doing the Lord's work, I guess.
Yeah.
I don't.
Yeah.
I guess it goes to show that it wasn't just the hallucinogens that were impacting it. It was.
Yeah, because he's probably not tripping in prison, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a great point. His these ideologies are deeply rooted at this point. So, and who knows? I mean, I'm sure he's found other people in prison that maybe have jumped on board with him too. But Jenn believed that neither her father nor Suzan feel any guilt or remorse. And Jenn felt more guilty than her father. For a long time, she felt responsible for making amends with the victims' families and, really felt like it was on her shoulders to keep her father in prison, which obviously, that's a lot to deal with. It's not her job. It's the prison system and the parole board's job to make sure they don't let somebody dangerous out, but I get it. As a relief to Jenn, the victims' families acknowledged Jenn as separate from her father and his actions. This is something she had feared most of her life. She has since learned so much from them about compassion, empathy, and forgiveness, and she no longer feels like she's a bad seed because of her father's actions. After earning her doctoral degree in social work, Jenn became a trauma expert. Over the years, she has been featured on CNN, Investigation Discovery, and NPR, speaking about her experience with her father and the aftermath of his crimes. She is also on the board of the American Association of Suicidology, a nonprofit suicide prevention organization, and she even works, if that wasn't enough, impressive, she even works as a counselor for children with emotional and behavioral challenges, which she had struggled with when she was in elementary school. She also participates in advocacy for children of prisoners and families of violent offenders. She continues to try and find something good that can come from such a horrific experience. I mean, just an absolute model.
Yeah. It's really
in how to deal, overcome your trauma and this experience you had growing up and make something good out of it.
Yeah, it's really the best case scenario here for her, I think. It's awesome that she can do things like this.
She also said, quote, "I think the other part of my story that I always like to share is that our children are resilient. If we can invest with time and love and connecting the child to the help they need, our children can overcome early trauma and recovery is possible." Michael Bear Carson, aka James Carson, or I guess I've heard people call him Jim as well. He's currently 74 and incarcerated in Mule Creek State Prison. Hopefully it's a fucking rough day every day there. Suzan Bear, aka Suzan Barnes, is currently 82 and incarcerated in Central California Women's Facility. Michael was denied parole in May 2020. His next hearing is tentatively scheduled for 2030. Suzan was denied parole for 15 years in 2015 and is now tentatively scheduled for another hearing in December of this year, 2025. Yeah. Really interested to see what comes out of that if they even grant it. I mean, if they agreed to move it up, I would expect that they would probably move forward with a hearing for her.
Yeah. I mean, and again, just to remind everyone, these hearings aren't,
doesn't mean guaranteed get out of jail free card or anything.
No. They reevaluate things. There's a parole board. It's, so, I mean, I highly doubt these people are ever going to get out. And I think, so this year she's 82. That's really old. And I mean, if they had left it up for another 5 years, 87,
most people aren't making it to 87.
No.
And if they do, then if they get out, she's not going to do any, what is she going to do at 87?
Yeah. I'd be shocked if I know.
But if I were, personally affected by these two, I would not want them to. I think they deserve to die in prison.
And I think they will. I'd be shocked if these two get out.
Well, it sounds like had it been in a different state that they committed these crimes, they likely would have ended up on death row.
Absolutely.
And could have even been executed.
Yeah.
So the fact that they've even gotten to live out, all these years in prison.
Right. And like they said, there was just the moratorium on the death penalty because they could have, if it was a different year, they might have been on death row.
I think these horrific crimes definitely warrant the severe punishment here, and especially since at least for Michael, it seems like he does not care at all, and that he doesn't think any differently of what he did, that he did exactly what he was supposed to do, what he wanted to do. And same guy that he was 30 years ago, which is scary. It was just very scary. So yeah, man. Scary couple.
Yeah,
scary
terrifying. But good on Lynn for kind of seeing the writing on the wall here and
Definitely.
leaving.
Definitely. And yeah, shout out to Jenn for getting
Shout out.
absolutely crushing
Yeah.
life after such a traumatic start to it,
Right.
and doing so much good for the world. And I love that.
Yeah, same.
Very inspiring. But yeah, definitely drop us your thoughts on these guys below. I'm curious to know what you think. Do you think this was like how much of it was drugs? How much of it was, potentially undiagnosed mental illness? How much of it was just sort of
Violent nature.
religious indoctrination,
Yep.
or just
Delusion across the board.
or is just a giant combo
Yeah. And then
of it all.
I kind of agree with Jenn too with the just calling him outright a psychopath.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it seems like he checks off all the boxes.
Yeah.
Definitely. Well, we're going to go ahead and wrap it up there today. Appreciate you for being here with us. And we'll catch you next week with another one. But until then, lights out, everybody.